If you were to ask the average person on the street to come up with a list of values they'd like to see in as perfect a world as humanly possible, that list would almost certainly include the following values. Value of life, which is certainly the most basic of all values, the right to be alive and to be treated with dignity. World peace, a world where there's no more wars and everyone gets along harmoniously. Equal justice, a world where everyone is treated equally before the law regardless of their position in society. Education, a world where everyone is at least functionally literate as a means of achieving their potential and contributing in a meaningful way to the world. Family, which is not a value but an institution that's essential for all values, because without stable family, we can't have stable society. Family is the institution that teaches people values. And certainly, last but not least, a huge category, social responsibility, which is people taking care of the world, whether we're talking about crime, poverty, animal rights, environmental issues. So we seem to have a universal list of values which more or less everyone in the world would probably agree should be. So if we have this universal list of values, the question is, where do we get the values from? What's the source? If we go back in time to the ancient world, would we also find that people in the ancient world also believed that these values were the ideal values for society? Obviously, we can't look at every single society that's lived in the ancient world. We have to pick and choose. I chose to focus primarily on those civilizations which we as Westerners give credit to for being the great foundation cultures of Western civilization, Greece and Rome. We appreciate that ancient Greece 2,500 years ago was one of history's most creative civilizations. Much of our conception of beauty, how we think, philosophy, empirical science comes from the ancient Greeks. And following in their footsteps came the ancient Romans, who besides spreading Greek ideas around through their vast empire, gave us much of our conception of government, law, engineering, the world's most successfully run empire. So we have Greece, Rome, and obviously many other civilizations contributed much to making the modern world what it is today. And even though we may not look at all of them, what's interesting is when we look at ancient history, we find that although culture varies tremendously in the ancient world, how people ate and dressed in Rome 2,000 years ago is very different from how they ate and dressed in China, values actually vary very little. What we basically find when looking at the ancient world and looking at their values is just variations on the same theme. So with that introduction, let's now go back in time to the ancient world, and let's look at how they related to these 6 basic universal values. The goal is to see, where do we get these values from? Where does our world-perfect vision of humanity originate? To begin at the first and most basic of all values, value of life. A number of examples to illustrate how different is the concept of the value of life in the ancient world. Virtually every single civilization we know of in the ancient world practiced infanticide, the killing of newborn babies, as a means not only of population control, but also as a means of sex selection, which means that in almost all ancient cultures, girls were considered disposable and boys were considered valued. And this wasn't done by the baby disposal squad. The father, mother, or midwife, immediately after birth, in the case of ancient Greece, the unwanted baby would be stuffed into a clay jar and then thrown into the garbage, or left out on a rock to be eaten by a wild animal or die of exposure, or dropped down a well to drown. This is the city of Ashkelon on the coast of Israel, a Greek-Roman city from 2,000 years ago. Archaeologists recently found in the remains of the bathhouses during their excavations the remains of over 100 newborn babies stuffed into the sewers after they were born. And this wasn't something that the upper class, better educated people thought was horrible. You can find some of the greatest minds in the ancient world extolling the virtue of killing babies. Aristotle wrote, "There must be a law that no imperfect or maimed child shall be brought up, and to avoid an excess of population, some children must be exposed, for a limit must be fixed to the population of the state." A Roman writing to his wife 2,000 years ago said, "Know that I am still in Alexandria, and I ask and beg of you to take good care of our baby son, and as soon as I receive payment I will send it up to you. If you deliver of a child, if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, discard it." Today we may be very desensitized to violence, but if we hear about the killing of a baby or an infant, we're still shocked. In the ancient world, you could talk about getting rid of your unwanted infant the way you would talk about your vacation plans, and no one would bat an eye. That's how normal and acceptable it was. Another shocking example of the different attitude towards value of life is killing people for religious reasons. Most cultures we know of practice some form of human sacrifice. Some practiced it to a tremendous extent, and some practiced it to a limited extent. The ancient Greeks and Romans did not do that much human sacrifice, but for many cultures it was the major feature of their religious worship. Some cultures sacrificed prisoners or slaves. When the Emperor of China died thousands of years ago, they would behead hundreds of prisoners at his funeral. When Genghis Khan, the great Mongol conqueror of Asia, died in the 13th century, he was buried with 40 virgins and 40 horses. Many cultures would sacrifice their own children, willing human sacrifice. An Inca girl from the Andes, killed over 500 years ago and buried at the top of the Andes Mountains. Because of the very low temperatures and high altitude, the body was remarkably well preserved. She's not a prisoner or slave, but rather a girl given by her parents as a sacrifice to the mountain gods. Bog people from northern Europe, more than 2,000 of such people have been found, mostly Celtic peoples from northern Europe, killed over 2,000 years ago. They're not considered to be prisoners or slaves, but rather willing sacrifices, killed, generally by strangulation, and then dumped into peat bogs where they were excavated thousands of years later. But probably the worst example of killing people for religious reasons are the Aztecs. The Aztecs lived under an area, what is today modern Mexico City. Their capital was an island in the middle of a lake called Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs, who were a remarkably sophisticated civilization, went to war with weapons that were non-lethal. They always tried to avoid killing people in combat if they could help it. They would take back thousands of prisoners, bring them to their capital city on this island, then drag them up these huge pyramids and rip out their hearts while they were still beating. Up to 1,000 people a week, because the Aztecs believed that if the blood stopped flowing, the world would cease to exist. It's human sacrifice on a scale that is absolutely mind-blowing. But probably the worst example of the different attitude towards value of life we see in the ancient world is killing people for entertainment. Today we have blood sport like boxing. But there are limits to the violence. If Mike Tyson bites off a piece of Evander Holyfield's ear, people get upset. There's limits to how much you hurt your opponent. In the ancient world, there was no such idea. Many cultures went all the way and killed people. The Aztecs, who we just looked at a minute ago, they had a version of football where at the end of the game, the entire winning team was sacrificed. But probably the most shocking example of killing people for entertainment are the ancient Romans. In over 200 locations throughout the Roman Empire, the Romans built giant circular arenas called amphitheaters. The most famous of all amphitheaters is no doubt located in the modern city of Rome, which was also the capital of the ancient Roman Empire called the Forum. There they built an amphitheater which we today know as the Colosseum. The correct name for this building is the Flavian Amphitheater. Completed in the year 80, the Romans considered this building to be one of their greatest feats of engineering. 2,000 years ago, it seated 50,000 people. It was also the world's first superdome. The roof could go off and on it. 2,000 years ago, the floor of the arena, which is gigantic, could be lowered mechanically and filled with water in under 15 minutes so boats could sail in it. Then you could take out the water, raise the floor up, put in fake trees and rocks like a Hollywood movie set. What was it used for? Almost every day when they had games, 50,000 men, women, and children would come for free, meaning no admission charged, all the meat you could eat, and all the wine you could drink. What would they see in the Colosseum? Well, the first act of the day was the Romans brought exotic animals from all over their empire, lions and tigers and bears, and watched them rip each other to shreds, sometimes up to 1,000 animals a morning. Now, animal rights people would have been very upset by this, but they would have been act number 2, which was feeding people to animals. Now, in the intermission, since the Romans didn't have commercials, they mass executed condemned prisoners by burning them, beheading them, or skinning them alive. But the main act of the day, which along with chariot races was the major sporting event in the Roman Empire, gladiators. Prisoners or slaves who fought to the death in front of thousands of screaming fans. All the emperors and many of the wealthy citizens of Rome bragged about the tournaments they sponsored. In the year 107, the Emperor Trajan writes that he held a huge tournament for many, many days in which 10,000 gladiators fought, which means if you sat through the whole tournament, you saw thousands of human beings killed. And the Romans didn't just use men. They used women, children, dwarves, and blind people. Anything for the sake of entertainment. On one hand, the most sophisticated civilization in the ancient world, and on the other hand, the most brutal. This, by the way, doesn't mean that the Romans allowed people to be murdered in the streets. Society would have fallen apart. But that's very different from saying life had value. And one thing we see when we look at the ancient world is that the most basic of all of our ideal values today, value of life, is virtually absent from the ancient world. For many reasons, including entertainment, people were considered disposable. Value number 2, world peace. Now today everyone wants peace. Years ago, during the Vietnam War, people used to walk around with buttons that said, "War is not healthy for children and other living things." And it's an obvious point that the greatest waste of human life and human resources is war. The world spends close to $100 billion a year acquiring weapons and spends trillions of dollars a year maintaining armies. Think what all that money could be used for good, for food, for housing, education, medical and scientific research. It's an obvious point how wasteful and destructive war is. And it must have been obvious to people in the ancient world. They had very intelligent people thousands of years ago, great philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Confucius. And these people sat and thought about the nature of reality. They must have realized that peace was good and that war was destructive. Yet if we look at 6,000 years of human history, we realize that 6,000 years of human history is 6,000 years of unceasing warfare. So the question we have to ask ourselves, if peace is obviously an ideal that everyone would logically want, then why is there so much war in human history? Why is peace so absent? If you read history books or anthropology books, certain basic reasons are given for why there's so much war in human history. Number 1 is just pure greed. We already saw that there's no stigma involved in killing people for entertainment and many other reasons in the ancient world. How much more so war? Because in war you get to rape and pillage and steal people's land and their women and their cattle and their gold. Number 2 reason is the law of the jungle. The lion's on top of the food chain because he eats everyone and no one eats him. He doesn't say to the gazelle in Africa, "You had a rough day, you rest by the waterhole, I'll go chase some zebras." The lion says, "I catch you your lunch." That's how lions behaved. That's how empires behaved. Ancient Rome never respected any country's borders or territorial integrity. If Rome didn't conquer someone in the ancient world, it's because Rome couldn't conquer. And not to conquer was a sign of weakness. And last but not least, and one of the major reasons for so much war in human history is that it's glorified. Heroes, by definition, in human history are warriors. The person that kills the most and greatest opponents gets the honor, the glory, and the power while they're alive, and becomes a legend after they're dead. To be an officer and a gentleman has been a manly pursuit for guys throughout human history. And it's glorified in literature everywhere. Wallace Caldwell of Columbia University writes, "War, therefore, is in the mind of the poet the chief business of men from youth to age. But he regards it as the special flower of youth. The glorification of war, the glamour and glory of battle were subjects of the finest words and pictures." Now, to be fair, the Romans had a period of 200 years, from 80 BCE until 120 CE, called Pax Romana, Roman peace. But what was the Roman idea of peace? We conquer the world and we have peace. That's not our idea of peace today. If you told the Romans 2,000 years ago that there'd be some ideal period in the future when there'd be no more wars, no armies, and nothing left to conquer, the entire empire would have needed Prozac. That's how depressed they would have been, because they lived for war. Peace in the ancient world was the break you took between wars to rearm. Otherwise, it's non-existent. So another of our basic ideal values bites the dust. Moving along to number 3, equal justice. Again, we take for granted the notion in any democratic society that everyone should be treated equally before the law regardless of their position in society. And we appreciate that the true power of all healthy democracy today is not so much the idea of whether you vote or not, but the idea of a constitution, of a system of laws that everyone is subject to and that no one is above. If we go back to the ancient world, we see the idea is very different. On the socioeconomic ladder throughout human history, the average person was a peasant or a serf. And feudalism and serfdom is not something just we find in feudal Europe hundreds of years ago. Rather, feudal systems exist throughout all of human history everywhere. What's the basic mechanics of feudalism? You have a huge sea of peasants or serfs. Generally, they're laborers, farmers, who work from dawn to dusk, back-breaking labor, usually working on land they didn't own. And even if they owned a small piece of land, they paid most of what they harvested in taxes to a teeny tiny elite of people, the lords. And what gave the lords the right to rule? It wasn't being democratically elected to a parliamentary system by the peasants. What gave them the right to rule was the golden rule. What's the golden rule? He who has the gold makes the rules, which means that birth and wealth were almost exclusively the sole criteria for leadership throughout human history. Who your parents are, what you owned, had nothing to do with being educated, nothing to do with being elected. And between the upper class, this teeny tiny elite, and the mass of peasants or serfs, rather than finding equality before the law, we find institutionalized inequality. There was one set of laws for the power elite, and virtually everyone else was at their mercy. And of course, above nobility in human history is the ultimate elite, monarchy. In the ancient world, someone like Pharaoh was a living god, completely above the law. By the time we get to Renaissance kings like Henry VIII or Louis XIV, they're no longer living gods, but they rule by divine right. What's divine right of kings? God made me king, and if you don't like it, I'll cut your head off. Tremendous inequality in human history is what we find. Now, to be fair, who invents the idea of democracy? The ancient Greeks, the Athenians of 2,500 years ago. The word is a Greek word, demos kratos, the people govern. And the Greeks had a much more efficient system of democracy than we have today. Today we have representational democracy. You vote for a congressman or a congresswoman who hopefully bothers to show up and vote the way you elected him to vote, which is by no means guaranteed. Which is probably why Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government, except for every other system we've tried from time to time throughout history. Perfect it isn't, but it's better than anything else. We see, however, that the Greeks had the most efficient system. Citizens vote directly, no representation. But who were citizens who could vote in Greek democracy? Athens had hundreds of thousands of people living in it thousands of years ago, yet only a few thousand men with land could vote. Of those hundreds of thousands that made up the population, many were slaves. They didn't vote. Women didn't vote. Freedmen, artisans, aliens didn't vote. A few thousand men with land whose fathers were citizens had the right to vote. That's an oligarchy. It's certainly an improvement over one crazy megalomaniac running the entire country, but it's very different from our system of one person, one vote, or true equality before the law. If you told the Athenians 2,500 years ago there'd be a time in human history when everyone would be treated equally before the law, regardless of their position in society, the Athenians would have said that is the craziest, most unjust idea we've ever heard. Henry Phelps Brown of Oxford University explains why. The Greeks distinguished strongly between different types of persons and thought it only proper to treat them differently. This inequality of treatment they endorsed in the name of justice, an endorsement that with Aristotle included the justification for slavery. Only those men were citizens who had certain qualifications. Beyond them it was taken for granted were all women, but also farmers, laborers, mechanics, freedmen, slaves, and aliens. So another of our basic values also gone. Moving along to the next value, education. This again is something we very much take for granted in the modern world. We assume that government will provide us with free education up through a certain age, usually high school. And not only do we assume that government has an obligation to provide us with education, we would also think that government would want to provide us with education. Because if you want to have a fully developed first world, technologically advanced country, you need an educated population. So we would expect that in empires like the ancient Roman Empire, which was so technologically advanced, they would have put a huge amount of public funds into mass education of the population. What's the reality, however? If we look back on the ancient world, what percentage of people do you think historians estimate were functionally literate? Not high school graduates, basic reading and writing skills. The percentage is remarkably low. 0.1%. The question is why? Historians give two basic reasons. One is something we very much take for granted. If you come from a first world country and you have a house with plumbing and electricity and a roof over your head and a 9-to-5 job and weekends and vacation and a health plan, and you live to see your grandchildren, you have a standard of living that exceeds virtually anyone who lived in the ancient world, and by the way, a standard of living that exceeds much of the third world today. What's the goal of the average peasant in the ancient world? On a day-to-day basis, it was just to survive. That too is the goal of most peasants in the third world today. Especially in the ancient world, before modern science and modern medicine, disease was rampant. You had incredible violence and famine and poverty, and giving birth was hazardous, and many, many children did not survive to reach maturity. And if your goal is survival, what do you have to do as soon as your children are old enough to do it? Work. Child labor is a universal phenomenon in the ancient world. What do you mean, send my kid to school? If he goes to school, we starve. And even if you were a little better off and could afford to send your children to school, you think you'd find free public education? No. And not only free education, even if you could afford to pay for education, it would be very unlikely to find a school to send your children to. Why? Because leaders in human history have always realized that the best way to control population is to keep the population ignorant. If we think about it, in the 1960s in America, which group instigated all the trouble? Where did the revolutionaries come from? Students. Because students are a unique population. On one hand, they're young and idealistic, and on the other hand, they're educated and empowered. Put those two together and you get an incredibly volatile bunch of people who will demand change. And leaders in the non-democratic ancient world realized the best way to maintain stability and maintain power is to keep people ignorant. And of course, the variation on that theme, which is as old as literacy itself, is censorship. Severely limit not only the number of people who can read, but what information people have access to. Even in places like the Roman Empire, which did need an educated bureaucracy to run the empire, the level of literacy was severely limited. Historians estimate between 10 and 15% of citizens of the Roman Empire were literate. Why? William V. Harris of Harvard University explains. The written culture of antiquity was in the main restricted to a privileged minority. It should be obvious that in Greece, and to an even greater extent in the Roman Empire, the illiteracy of the masses contributed to the stability of political order. The disturbances caused by the spread of literacy, on the other hand, have been numerous and varied. The Greeks and Romans would have become very different people if, per impossible, they'd achieved mass literacy. So whether for reasons of just survival or deliberate government policy, virtually no one in the ancient world was even functionally literate. Moving along to family. Now, family is a universal phenomenon in human history. All cultures and civilizations have family. But we want to look at a subcategory of family, which is a topic which most of us know nothing about, but which is a topic which has had a huge impact on not only family stability, but the stability of whole cultures, nations, and empires. And that's the impact of sexuality and modesty on family stability. Today, we live in a world where the standards have changed dramatically over the last few decades. A country like America used to be very, very conservative about what they would talk about or show on television. Nowadays, decades later, in the beginning of the 21st century, those standards have changed dramatically, to the point where virtually anything goes, even on public television. Today, sexuality pervades everything. The less clothing, the more nudity, the more violence, the more shocking, the better it sells. And we see this in advertising also. It used to be that they would show you the product on television they were advertising. Nowadays, the product often doesn't even appear. Show a woman, she'll sell the product. We today think we're overwhelmed by this. We see it everywhere. Sexuality, immodesty, everywhere in the world. But compared to the ancient world, we live in a very puritanical, conservative world. I personally believe if the Greeks and Romans had television and advertising, their civilization would not have survived 1 year. That's how much worse they were than we are today. A couple of examples to illustrate. Greek and Roman art from thousands of years ago. And we could just as easily as put in place of this Greek and Roman art, Chinese or Indian art. A couple of things we see right away. One is that the ancient Greeks and Romans and any other civilization not only had no problem with full frontal nudity, even on their best dinnerware, but with showing graphic pornography. Which means when you got to the bottom of your cornflakes bowl in ancient Greece, you didn't see Winnie the Pooh. You saw something much, much worse. And you notice that everyone is naked and everyone looks perfect. Why? The Greeks, who idolized sports, that's where the Olympics come from, did all of these sports in the nude because they believed that the physical form, the human body, was the ultimate expression of beauty, and you wanted to show it to the world. And everything should look perfect. Where did the Greeks practice their sports? In a building called the gymnasium. the same name of the building that we did our sports in school. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. And you notice, of course, that everyone looks perfect. Idealizing the physical form was a major focus of ancient classical culture. The whole concept of modesty in the ancient world is dramatically different. Nude, clothed, it just wasn't important to people. Even in the most liberal society today, if a person needs to use a public toilet, they go into a room that says men or woman and they go into a stall. Public toilets in the ancient world in places like Greece were public toilets. It was a bench on the main street with a hole in it, out in the open, and you did your business as people walked by. Everything was considered normal and acceptable. The whole standard was remarkably different from even the most liberal society today. Now, in the area of sexuality, the contrast is even more extreme. Now, today, if we look back over the last 30, 40 years, we see the standard in the West has changed dramatically. People are very open and accepting of everything. The catchphrase in the Western world today is what consenting adults want to do behind closed doors is their business. You don't discriminate against people because of their sexual preference. You can come out of the closet. Today in the West, we think we're totally open and accepting of everything. Again, compared to the ancient Greeks or Romans or much of the ancient world, we live in a very conservative world. In the ancient world, there was no idea of coming out of the closet. There was no idea of correct or incorrect sexual behavior, which means as a male in most civilizations in the ancient world, it was considered equally acceptable for your partner in a physical relationship to be another man, a boy, a woman, a girl, an animal, even often an inanimate object. And sexuality permeated the world in ways that is almost impossible for us today, even in our very liberal society, to comprehend. Even the most liberal society today in the world would still say what consenting adults want to do behind closed doors is their business, but adult men, please keep your hands off of little boys. That's called pederasty. Many civilizations in the ancient world considered a sexual and educational relationship between an adult man and a pre-adolescent, a young boy, to be not only the highest form of love, but an absolutely vital part of a child's education. And this idea is expounded on by many of the great thinkers of the ancient world. Here's Plato. I, for my part, am at a loss to say what a greater blessing a man can have in earliest youth than an honorable lover. If we could somehow contrive to have a city or an army composed of lovers and their favorites, they could not be better citizens of their country. No man is such a craven that love's own influence cannot inspire him with valor that makes him equal to the bravest born. And unlike the stereotype image we have today of the effeminate homosexual male, many cultures in the ancient world considered that real men chased boys. Wimps wasted their time on women. The ancient Greeks, especially the militaristic city-state of Sparta, took this philosophy very seriously. They had whole army units of older men who fought in battle with their younger boyfriends. And these were the toughest units in the Greek army, because no one wanted to die ingloriously in front of their lover. This is also true of Japanese samurai culture. Again, a very different conception than we have today. The question is, where do women fit into this society? Look at the Greek poet Palladius from thousands of years ago. Marriage brings a man only two happy days, the day he takes his bride to bed and the day he lays her in her grave. The Greek poet Propertius wrote, May all my enemies fall in love with women and all my friends with boys. It's a curse to fall in love with a woman. Aristotle, the great philosopher, taught that women were so useless that their sole purpose is to serve as an incubator for male seed. Today we find this shocking, but it's a fact of history that one of the greatest, most free-thinking, open cultures of the ancient world, the Greeks, was also one of the most misogynist, women-hating cultures of all time. Now, women in ancient Rome were treated considerably better, although it's not hard to improve on the treatment of women in ancient Greece. But Rome, too, was a very patriarchal society. Men completely ruled that society. And although the Romans made fun of the Greeks, who they viewed as being much too physically and sexually decadent, the Romans, in fact, became as bad or worse than the Greeks. If you read the Roman historian Suetonius, who wrote the book The Lives of the 12 Caesars, and you look what was going on in the royal families, the leading families, the model for the society of ancient Rome, we see what a disaster that society was from the top down. So bad was it that Suetonius, the historian, writes about Julius Caesar, the most macho of all Romans. He's every man's woman and every woman's man. What's the impact of this on family stability and societal stability? On a very basic level, we see that society rotted. From the top down, the leading families that were supposed to be the moral models for the country were in fact the worst models. Decadence pervaded the Roman Empire at the end of the empire in ways that had huge impact on stability of the empire. But on a more basic level, the birth rate of the ancient Greeks and Romans was also profoundly affected. The birth rate of Greek city-states dropped precipitously. Rome built the greatest empire in human history because Roman citizens fought and died in the Roman legions. By the end of the empire in the 5th century of the Common Era, when Rome collapsed, their birth rate was so low, Rome had no children left to fight in their army. The Romans passed laws trying to force men to marry and have children, but you can't force people to have children. It has to be of value in society. Some of the greatest civilizations in the ancient world literally rotted from within before they were overrun from without, because sexuality and modesty was completely out of control and because family fell apart. Another value gone. Now, last but not least, we have the idea of social responsibility. And today we also take this very much for granted. Today, in any liberal democratic society, if you're down on your luck, out of work, homeless, you have a disease, but you don't have a health plan, government will help you because it's government's obligation to help. In the ancient world, we have no such thing. The vast majority of social welfare programs that exist in the world today only came into existence during the last few hundred years. Before that, you had nothing. In ancient Rome of 2,000 years ago, which was one of the largest cities on the planet Earth, if you were homeless, diseased, down on your luck, and you didn't have family to help, tough, die. Government would do absolutely nothing for you. Now, today we also have this idea of international responsibility. If there's an earthquake in India or Turkey or a flood in Honduras, people from around the world come to help. Governments take responsibility. We have Doctors Without Borders, the International Monetary Fund, United Nations relief workers, multinational peacekeeping forces. The world cares. In the ancient world, you had none of this. Can you imagine asking the ancient Roman Empire for a peacekeeping force? It's a very scary thought. What were leaders in the ancient world concerned with? It wasn't making the world a better place. Look at what Genghis Khan, the great Mongol conqueror of Asia, has to say about what's meaningful. The greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them bathed in tears, to clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. A true humanitarian visionary. So we see that this value, along with all of our other utopian values that make up this universal vision, also absent from the ancient world. So what are we left with? A very different vision of the values of the ancient world than we probably got in elementary school. Which is not to say that everyone in the ancient world were horrible, evil, heartless, uncaring people. The average person on the street was just trying to survive. And obviously lots of wonderful things came from the ancient world. But one thing we do see is, as beautiful as these things were, we don't get our modern utopian vision from even the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. So we're left with a question. If we don't get these values from these civilizations, like Greece and Rome, where do we get them from? There's a British historian by the name of Paul Johnson, who's the author of a book called The History of the Jews. And in the epilogue of this book, Paul Johnson says something fascinating, which goes a long way towards answering our question. One way of summing up 4,000 years of Jewish history is to ask ourselves, what would have happened to the human race if Abraham had not been a man of great sagacity, or if he had stayed in Ur and kept his higher notions to himself and no specific Jewish people would have come into being? Certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. Humanity might eventually have stumbled upon all the Jewish insights, but we cannot be sure. All the great conceptual discoveries of the human intellect seem obvious and inescapable once they have been revealed, but it requires a special genius to formulate them for the first time. The Jews had this gift. To them we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. Above all, the Jews taught us how to rationalize the unknown. The result was monotheism and the three great religions which profess it. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged. If we look at the list of ethical contributions that Paul Johnson names and compare it to humanity's utopian vision, we see a remarkable parallel. Paul Johnson's making an incredible statement. The universal ideal values of the modern world are overwhelmingly a product of the Jews. And it's not just Paul Johnson who says this. There are literally dozens of prime ministers and presidents, politicians, writers, thinkers, and historians who say the same thing. Humanity's universal utopian vision comes overwhelmingly from the Jews. Now, what Paul Johnson isn't saying is that the Jews are perfect and everyone else in the ancient world is terrible. It's not true. There are many, many righteous Gentiles and lots of terrible Jews in human history. And many wonderful things have come out of the non-Jewish world. We're not talking about a popularity contest here, but it is a fact that the utopian universal vision is overwhelmingly a product of the Jews. We're also not saying that the words peace and justice were invented by the Jewish people. The Greeks talk often about the idea of justice and its importance for society. But the Jewish people were able to have an impact on the collective consciousness of humanity which no one else is able to duplicate. As to why the Jewish people were able to have this impact, we'll see in a few minutes. But what we'd like to do now is let's go back again to our list, and let's examine all of these values in light of what Judaism has to say. What we'll see is that in every single one of these areas, Judaism is truly revolutionary. Let's begin with the value of life. The clearest distinction between the Jewish conception of value of life and that of virtually every other civilization in the ancient world can best be seen by number 6 of the Ten Commandments. Do not murder. Judaism taught the world that life has intrinsic value. Judaism taught the world you don't kill babies. Gods don't need human blood. And you certainly don't kill people for entertainment. Why is the commandment written, do not murder, and isn't written, do not kill? Because we know in Jewish law there is a death penalty. Because Judaism teaches that there's good and there's evil in this world, and sometimes you must destroy evil before it destroys good. But because life is so valuable from the Jewish perspective, it is extremely difficult for a Jewish court to sentence someone to death, and a person should violate virtually every commandment of the Torah to save a life. This is beautifully illustrated by the famous quote from the Talmud, "He who saves one life is as if he saves an entire universe." The infinite value of human life. This quote is especially impressive when we keep in mind that it's being said by the rabbis of the Talmud at the same time as the Romans are killing thousands of people for entertainment. The Jewish conception of value of life, truly revolutionary. If we look at the idea of peace from the Jewish perspective, we see that the Jews are probably history's most peace-obsessed people. The word for peace in Hebrew is shalom, and it's also the word for hello. So basic is peace to the Jewish worldview that that's how we greet our fellow man, shalom. The word shalom appears 240 times in the Hebrew Bible. And along with a constant repetition of the word, the concept is repeated over and over again in the later books of the Bible and by later Jewish thinkers. Out of this comes a unique view of what peace is about, the ideal state for humanity. Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar living about 850 years ago in Egypt, codified all of Jewish law and all of Jewish philosophy into his magnum opus called the Mishnah Torah. And in it we see the unique Jewish view of peace. The sages and prophets did not long for the Messianic era in order to rule the world nor to subdue the nations, but to be free to pursue Torah and its wisdom. At that time there will be no hunger and no war, no jealousy and no strife. The entire world will be entirely occupied to acquire the knowledge of God, as it says. The world will be full of the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. But the best proof of the intense Jewish focus on the idea of peace can certainly be seen at the headquarters of the world body that is today dedicated to bringing peace to humanity, the United Nations. If you go to UN General Assembly headquarters in New York, outside the building is a wall. On that wall is the motto of the UN, which is a quote from the Jewish prophet Isaiah from 2,500 years ago. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Why is this quote on the wall of the UN of all the quotes we have about peace? Because the founders of the United Nations know that the people who first introduced peace as the ideal state for all humanity are the Jewish people. Equal justice. Judaism is also deeply concerned with the idea of justice. In Hebrew, the word for justice is tzedek. It's interesting that in Hebrew, the word for charity is tzedakah. The Jewish concept of the root of tzedakah comes from the idea of justice. The word tzedek, justice, appears 120 times in the Jewish Bible. And out of this concept of justice comes a unique Jewish worldview about equality before the law. It says in Leviticus 19:15, "You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. You shall not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. But in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." This is the Bible's way of saying that justice must be meted out to all people equally. Everyone is equal before the law, regardless of their position in society. Today we have a hard time understanding just how unequal justice was in the ancient world. In the ancient world, and even in the not-so-ancient world, we had all-powerful kings completely above the law. When you compare that to a Jewish king, you see how unique is the Jewish view of equality and justice. Every Jew is supposed to write a Torah scroll, but a Jewish king is supposed to write a second scroll and carry it with him wherever he goes. Why does the king have to walk around with a Torah scroll? It says in Deuteronomy, "And when the king sits on the throne of his kingdom, he will write a copy of the Torah, and it will be with him and he will read from it all the days of his life. So he will learn to fear the Lord his God, and keep all the words of his Torah and do its statutes." The king has to know there's a King of Kings, God. No one, not even the king, is above the law. Most people don't understand the biblical government of ancient Israel. It was not a pure monarchy, nor was it a theocracy. Rather, it was a mixed system of checks and balances. In ancient Israel, you had a chief political leader, the king, a chief religious leader, the high priest, and the real judicial legislative power within the country rested in the court system, at the top of which was the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of the State of Israel, 2,000 years ago. 71 of the most learned judges sat and issued final decrees that made up Jewish law. If you look at the qualifications for being in power in the Sanhedrin, you see how truly revolutionary was the Jewish conception of equality and power. Remember that in the ancient world and throughout most of human history, power was given to those based on birth and wealth. But to sit on the Sanhedrin, you had to be married with children, because the Sanhedrin could pass the death sentence. Every human being is someone's child. Being a parent teaches you mercy. But most importantly, you had to have encyclopedic knowledge of everything, especially Jewish law, and unquestioning integrity. Revolutionary. Birth and wealth were not relevant. Who you were was not important. Rather, what you knew. That's what decided whether you could sit on the Sanhedrin. It was a true meritocracy. Education. Now, education is something that has been very central to the Jewish worldview for thousands and thousands of years. As a matter of fact, most Jewish parents probably believe that there are 11 big commandments. Number 11 is, "Thou shalt go to college." And it's interesting, if we look in the world today, in a place like the United States, where Jews comprise 2% of the population on average, they make up, on average, 10% of the student body and faculty of virtually every college and university in America, and 25% of the student body and faculty of the Ivy League schools. Jews being in higher education has nothing to do with Jews being wealthy and free in modern history. Rather, it has to do with the unique status the Jewish people have had in history. The Jewish people are history's only literate nation. Not the only nation that liked wisdom. Many ancient nations valued wisdom, the Greeks and the Chinese. But only the Jewish people had consistently high rates of literacy throughout all periods of time. Even the smallest, poorest Jewish communities generally had rates of literacy that were far higher than the peoples amongst whom they lived. And this has to do not with wealth and not with connections, but rather with the unique Jewish view about education. In the ancient world, as we already mentioned, many leaders followed a deliberate policy of keeping people ignorant and illiterate as a way of controlling them. Judaism taught the exact opposite. It's a fundamental belief of the Jewish worldview that as a human being with free will, you have an obligation to use your free will effectively to make the world a better place. You cannot do that unless you're educated. You must be educated, or you negate the reason why you were created. Maimonides 850 years ago states this powerfully. Appoint teachers for the children in every country, province, and city. In any city that does not have a school, excommunicate the people of the city until they get teachers for the children. If they don't, destroy the city, because the world exists only because of the breath of children studying. Destroy the city? No Jewish community was ever destroyed because it didn't have a school, because the Jewish people literally had free public education, often thousands of years before other peoples thought of it. Lest you think this is just Jewish propaganda, look at what medieval French Catholic monk Peter Abelard has to say about the Jews in the 12th century. A Jew, however poor, if he had 10 sons, would put them all to letters. Not for gain as the Christians do, but for understanding of God's law, and not only his sons, but his daughters. Family. The Jewish people also introduced a very unique concept regarding family, family relationships, and the whole notion of sexuality and modesty. If we look at the first male-female relationship in the Bible, Adam and Eve in Genesis, already we see the difference. It says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, "A man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and they will become one flesh." The Bible isn't talking about giving your wife a hug. It's bringing in a complex metaphysical idea called zivug, which is that a man and a woman are two halves of a whole. They come together to make one unit. You're not complete until you're married. On top of that, the Bible teaches that the sexual and emotional energy of a man has to be focused exclusively into a legally binding relationship called marriage and should not be expressed outside that relationship. Judaism taught the world through the Bible, you stay away from little boys and prostitutes and other things. Now, Judaism is not anti-sexual. We don't believe in the idea of sex as being sinful, but rather that it's something special and reserved for this unique relationship called marriage. We know that in Jewish law it's a legal obligation for a man to satisfy his wife, and not to do so is grounds for divorce. Judaism also taught that marriage is a sacred institution that's based on love and respect. As Maimonides said beautifully, and so our rabbis decreed, that a man should honor his wife more than himself, and love her as much as he loves himself. Short but profound, especially when compared to the Greek poet Palladius. Marriage brings a man only 2 happy days, the day he takes his bride to bed and the day he lays her in her grave. Few of us realize how much the Bible's conception of the sanctity of marriage and of controlling sexuality has had a positive influence on stabilizing culture and the history of many empires. Man's nature, undisciplined by values, will allow sex to dominate his life and the life of society. When Judaism demanded that all sexual activity be channeled into marriage, it changed the world. It is not overstated to say that the Torah's prohibition of non-marital sex made the creation of Western civilization possible. Societies that did not place boundaries around sexuality were stymied in their development. The subsequent dominance of the Western world can, to a significant extent, be attributed to the sexual revolution initiated by Judaism and later carried forward by Christianity. Social responsibility. Here too we see another tremendous Jewish contribution, and here too we see the other unique status of the Jewish people in history. In addition to being history's only literate nation in the ancient world, the Jewish people are the only people in the ancient world to be socially aware, truly socially aware. The only nation throughout all of its history to have a highly developed sense of social consciousness and social welfare infrastructure. At all periods of time, in all places that we know of, even the smallest, poorest Jewish communities had social welfare infrastructure far more comprehensive and far older than the larger societies in which they lived. This unique status is the outgrowth of a very powerful idea that the Jewish people taught the world, which is best summarized by 2 short quotes from the Bible. Leviticus 19:16, Lo talmod al dam re'echa, don't stand by your neighbor's blood. The Bible teaches that if you see a human being in distress, physical, emotional, economic, you have an obligation to help. Law is the natural outgrowth of all societies. As they develop, they also have to develop a code of law so that society can function. Virtually all law codes in human history say more or less the same thing. Don't steal, don't murder, pay your taxes, you're a good citizen. Now, Jewish law also says these things, but Judaism, through the Bible, adds a unique component: actively do good. Today, virtually anywhere in the world, if you see someone in distress and you don't help, you're a bystander. Judaism teaches no. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. Doing nothing makes you part of the problem, and you have a legal obligation to be part of the solution. Until today, there is virtually no law code on the planet Earth that demands that you actively do good. This concept of doing good is best expressed by one of the most famous quotes from the Bible, Leviticus 19:18, V'ahavta li'arecha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, love your neighbor as yourself is not some vague idea. It has practical application in Jewish law. You have to give 10% of your income to charity, whether you like it or not. You have to help the widow and the orphan. And it's not just helping human beings. The first environmental law, the first animal rights legislation appearing anywhere in the world appears in the Bible. It's part and parcel of the Jewish worldview and a reality in the Jewish social infrastructure, all periods of time, everywhere. Many of the great social thinkers of the non-Jewish world will often quote the Bible especially, and the Jewish people in particular, as their source of inspiration that inspired them to push social legislation. Thomas Huxley, the famous 19th century biologist and social thinker, wrote, "The Bible has been the Magna Carta of the poor and oppressed. Down to modern times, no state has had a constitution in which the interests of the people are so largely taken into account, in which the duties, so much more than the privileges of the rulers, are insisted upon, as that drawn up for Israel in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Nowhere is the fundamental truth that the welfare of the state, in the long run, depends on the righteousness of the citizens so strongly laid down." The American preacher and publicist Lyman Abbott wrote, "It would be impossible to mention any other people of even a much later age, whose law and constitution embodied an ideals so noble as that embodied in Hebrew civil laws, or any people whose history shows the existence of political institutions so essentially just, free, and humane. We Gentiles owe our life to Israel. It is Israel who, in bringing us the divine law, has laid the foundation of liberty. It is Israel who had the first free institutions the world ever saw. When sometimes our own unchristian prejudices flame out against the Jewish people, let us remember that all that we have and all that we are, we owe under God to what Judaism has given us." So what we see is this amazing fact of history, that the Jewish people have had an absolutely monumental impact on humanity's conception of right and wrong. But we're still left with one giant question. Why were the Jewish people, the tiny Jewish people, able to have such a monumental impact in human history? To understand the answer to that question, we must look at one more Jewish contribution to human consciousness. It's the idea from which we get all of this beautiful ethical moral vision, and the idea without which we have none of it. So the question remains, what is the greatest Jewish contribution to civilization? The answer is clearly the notion of one God and one standard of morality for all humanity that emanates from that God: ethical monotheism. We now today appreciate that this idea is certainly the most powerful idea in human history in shaping humanity's view of what is right and wrong. Today it's obvious to us, but in the ancient world it was very far from obvious. If we just jump back in time, briefly, we'll see, in the ancient world, everyone was religious, but all religions were polytheistic, meaning that every culture had its pantheon, its whole list of gods. Every force in nature had its own god to represent it. Zeus was the god of heaven, Poseidon the god of the sea. And you as a human being perceived that every one of these gods wanted something different from you. And these gods were made in the image of man, and every one exerted his influence on you. One god wanted X, another god wanted Y. Because there were multiple gods and multiple sources of morality, there was no one standard. Therefore, the whole ancient world was amoral. And because it was amoral, it was also immoral. In the words of the great Russian writer Dostoevsky, where there is no God, everything is permissible. Why did you have a world where even in the most advanced, sophisticated civilizations you had tremendous suffering, inhumanity, cruelty, the killing of babies, blood sport, illiteracy, injustice, and no social responsibility? It all came out of a world where no one could say this is right and this is wrong. Into this world almost 4,000 years ago, out of a place we used to call Ur, today we call Iraq, came one man, Abraham. And Abraham is certainly one of history's great idealists. And Abraham's unique for two specific things. In a world that was entirely amoral and into paganism, polytheism, Abraham, using just the power of his mind, came to the realization that in fact, underlying reality was one God and one source of morality from that God. Can you imagine being the only human being in the world to believe in an idea which no one else could comprehend or accept? None of us would have the nerve to whisper it to our best friends. And that brings us to the true greatness of Abraham. He doesn't care what anyone thinks. Abraham is a true idealist. He says, I choose to dedicate my life to reconnecting humanity to God. Because without that relationship with God, and without the moral ethical values that comes from that relationship, humanity is going to eat each other alive. This is what Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad is all about. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is the central focus of Jewish worldview throughout all history, reconnecting humanity to its Creator and to the ethical moral vision that comes from one God. If we look at the power of this idea, we can see what a formative effect it's had on shaping our conception of morality. If we go back to the beginning of the Bible, we see that at the very beginning in Genesis, when God creates human beings, he says human beings are created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. We know that the godlike thing that every human being has is not physical. God, being infinite, has no parts. Rather, it's spiritual. Every human being is endowed with a unique soul, a divine spark, a piece of the infinite. The implications of being created in the image of God are powerful. If we look at the notion of value of life, if every human being has this infinite spark within him, then the Bible is telling us that every life is of infinite value. The whole notion of value of life stems from this idea of being created in the image of God. And if every human being has this infinite spark within him, the Bible is teaching us that there's a fundamental equality amongst all people, for we are all God's children. And if every human being has this soul, and if we're made in the image of God, then we have an obligation to act like God. One of the commandments of the Bible is, V'halachta b'drachav, be like God, go in his ways. Which means, just as God is kind and merciful, so too do you, as a human being made in his image, have an obligation to be kind and merciful. It's very hard for us to appreciate the incredible impact of this concept on human consciousness. One individual who definitely appreciated the impact of one God on the concept of morality is John Adams, second President of the United States. I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of another sect, I should still believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate for all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire are but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. This is in fact the historical mission of the Jewish people. This is what the idea of light unto nations is all about. A people who reconnects humanity to God by serving as a living example of a nation that embodies this relationship and teaches the world by example these beautiful values: peace, value of life, justice, freedom, education. This also brings us to one of the most misunderstood concepts the world has regarding the Jewish people, the idea of chosen. What does chosen people mean? The Jewish worldview teaches us that chosen means Abraham says to God, God, I choose to live with the reality of you, to dedicate my life to you, to bringing humanity back to you. And God says back to Abraham, Abraham, you choose me? Then I choose you and your descendants, the Jewish people. What are the Jews chosen for? It's not privilege, but rather responsibility. What's the responsibility? In Hebrew, it's called tikkun olam, fix the world. It's the ultimate cause of being the nation that teaches the world values and elevates humanity to the highest moral, ethical standard humanly possible and creates the most beautiful world humanly possible. This brings us to the last great question. How did the Jewish people do this? We understand how the Greeks and Romans had their influence on the world. They conquered the world and they exported their culture to other peoples. We understand how Christianity and Islam had a huge impact. They sent people to proselytize. But the Jewish people never had a great empire. And Judaism certainly does not teach that we proselytize. As a matter of fact, it's very hard to convert to Judaism. It's made difficult to convert. So how did the Jewish people have this impact? For 2,000 years, the Jews were the only people in the world believing and living with the reality of one God. From Abraham until the birth of Christianity, it remained an exclusive concept of the Jewish people, and the rest of the world looked at the Jews with contempt and misunderstanding. The story of Hanukkah is history's first ideological war. 1,200 years ago, the Greeks went to war against the Jews to a large extent based on the cultural differences and the Jewish conception of one God, which was incomprehensible to the polytheistic world. After 2,000 years of the world not understanding the Jews and persecuting them, will evolve historically and theologically two great offshoot faiths, Christianity and Islam. Both these great faiths will ultimately convert billions of people to a worldview that is much closer to Judaism than any polytheistic worldview that existed previously. Because any Christian or Muslim will tell you that in fact there is one God, creator of the universe, and one standard of morality for all of humanity. How did Jewish ethical ideas get to places that may not be Christian or Muslim? To answer that question, we have to look at the greatest political force in modern human history, democracy. The founding fathers of democracy in England and America in the 17th and 18th centuries focused strongly on the notion of God as the source of values and the Bible as the guidebook for creating a truly just political system. We can see this clearly just by looking at the Declaration of Independence of the United States, the world's oldest country established as a democracy. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Today, when looking back on human history, we have to appreciate this tremendous impact that Jewish people have had. And Jewish people, when looking at their history, have to have Jewish pride. Pride is not arrogance, but rather justifiable self-respect at the historically proven power of Jewish people and Jewish ideas to change the world. It's a fact of history that the world is in a completely different place because of this notion of one God and one standard of morality that the Jewish people brought to collective human consciousness. But it's also a fact of history that as much as the world now accepts this vision and wants this as the ultimate dream for humanity, the world has not been able to actualize it. True, the world has moved much closer, but there is still much suffering, much injustice, and much lack of social responsibility. The Jewish people still have a very important role to play. When we look at the future of the Jewish people specifically and humanity in general, we have to keep a few basic lessons in mind. One of the most fundamental teachings that the Jews taught the world is the notion of perfecting the world is not just for a person by the name of Messiah, but rather is the collective responsibility of all human beings. Judaism teaches that every human being, like a snowflake, is unique. Each of us has something that only we can contribute to making the world a better place. And it is our job to use our lives to bring out our unique potential to contribute in only the way that we can contribute. But the question is, how do we bring out our potential? If you buy a complicated piece of equipment, like a car or a computer, it comes with an instruction manual. Judaism teaches that our manufacturer in heaven, God, gave us as human beings an instruction manual. It's called Torah. The literal definition of Torah means instructions for living. It's the guidebook for how to bring out your unique potential as individuals and as a nation. A Jew who is aware of his mission and knows his Bible will soon realize that it's his job as part of the Jewish people to be a light unto nations. It's interesting that historically and statistically, Jews volunteer for causes more than any other people on the planet Earth. The thing that Jews are ultimately supposed to stand for, however, is values, because it's only by changing humanity's values will the world truly be a different place and truly elevate itself to this beautiful moral ethical standard. And Judaism teaches that the job of teaching humanity these values is the collective responsibility of all the Jewish people. The Jewish people must be unified to accomplish this mission. This may sound like the impossible dream, elevating the world to this beautiful vision of peace, justice, and harmony. But any student of Jewish history will soon realize for the Jewish people what is seemingly impossible is possible if the Jewish people are unified and educated and teaching the world, and the world follows. The person who said this most beautifully is the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. A Jew who does not believe in miracles is not a realist. When the Jewish people come together, proud, unified, and educating the world and acting as a light to nations, then they will finally be able to elevate the world to the beautiful vision that humanity now wants, the vision that is beautifully encapsulated by the prophet Isaiah 2,500 years ago. The mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills. And all the nations shall flow into it, and many people shall go and say, Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. If we look at a graph of religions of the world, we see something fascinating. On such a graph, the Jewish people do not even appear. So small are they in the world today. We need a magnifying glass to see them. But if we look on the graph of Jewish impact on the world, the Jewish people go right off the top of the scale. A tiny nation, but looking in the grand sweep of human history, they've had an absolutely monumental impact.